Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Managing Snails in Western Australia webinar. Our presenters today are Elena Smith, a grower from South Stirlings, and Svetlana Mitric, a deep herd research entomologist based at Albany. We will be answering questions at the end of the webinar, so please use the Q&A tool and the chat function to enter any questions. I will now hand over to Elena and Svetlana to introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Svetlana Mitric. I'm an entomologist here with the Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development, and I've been working on snails for quite a few years now. And Elena.
I'm Elena Smith. I'm a grower on the South Coast. We run a property with canola, barley, wheat, sheep and cattle, and we've had issues with snails for a couple of years now, and we've been working with them through our grower group, Stirlings to Coast Farmers.
And so we'll be presenting some of the research that has been done through Stirlings to Coast Farmers, as well as with GRDC and COGO funding. So what we're going to do is Elena and I are going to have a conversation with you. So we'll be talking to each of the slides, and we'll be hopefully not talking over ourselves, but having just a conversation about the best practice management that we can do for snails in our part of the world. And what we're going to do is we're going to make the talk to reflect what you need to do throughout the season. So before seeding, during seeding, and at harvest, what you can do to control snails. So I guess one thing about the small pointed or small conical snail is that snails are hermaphrodites. You just need one mating pair and they both will lay eggs, and eggs will hatch 2 to 4 weeks after laying. But it takes a year for snails to reach sexual maturity. So you have a year in which to do something. In WA, we don't just have the small conical snail. I know, Elena, that's your biggest issue, is a small conical.
It is.
And you haven't had round snails yet, but we do have round snails, which are the vineyard snail and the white Italian snail, as well as the small conical snail present in our broadacre growing areas, mainly in the southern parts of the state. But we also have the large pointed snail, Cochlocella acuta, in very, very small, discrete areas. But that one is another one to keep an eye out for. So we're going to talk about the management practices for mainly the small conical snail, because it is very difficult to control. So you'll be pulling your hair out with that one, Elena.
It is a problem.
So, and one of the main reasons is that if you see this graph, you can see that the white Italian snail, when we fed them baits, they all died. But when we fed the small conical or small pointed snail baits, we got very little mortality at the time of year that we tried this trial. We did have the snails being hungry, but obviously the small conical snails were not as hungry. Baits were applied into tote boxes where there was alternative food.
So, as I said, I'm a farmer on the South Coast, and we have had small conical snails on our property for quite some time before they became a problem. They were mainly around sheds, so they obviously had come in on vehicles, and also in areas where there was exposed limestone, which Svet will explain the relationship between small conical snails and limestone later. It really hit us hard with canola not emerging one year. That's when we first knew we had a problem with small conical snails. And that coincided with another number of factors, which was we were increasing our cropping program. We had increased the liming. We obviously are no-till, so we had a lot of stubble there. And we also, at the time, we had a decrease in sheep numbers, which may have been helping to control them in the past. And I think the earlier sowing of canola has probably also provided a really nice habitat or a nice food source earlier in the season for snails, as well as the nice habitat we've provided through no-till and liming.
And I guess we'll have a bit of a chat about what your liming's done, because what we did was we did a little trial looking at what effect lime actually had on snails, and this is the small pointed snail. And what we found was that if you had lime, you actually got stronger snail shells, and you got the strongest shell if you put lime on the surface. I know that your farming enterprise has tried to incorporate lime, And that's why one of the reasons we did this was we mixed the lime in with the soil, and what we found was that snails still got a heavy dose of lime and were able to have stronger shells. And the stronger the shell is, the more likely it is that they're going to survive a hot, dry summer, and they'll survive also grazing by livestock. And that's the same for the round snails as well. The other thing we looked at was what effect lime had on fecundity, the number of eggs or that snails lay. And what we found was that if you limed, you did get more eggs being laid than if you didn't. So even though the control is quite low, there's no significant difference between some of our lime sources, they still, if you had lime, you did get more eggs being laid. So it doesn't really matter where the lime is from, but the more lime you have, the more eggs sort of get laid. So
yeah, and obviously we can't do it without liming, so we've just had to learn to manage them.
And I think that's one thing, is the management practices that you put in place are a long-term solution. It's not you're going to be able to control snails right now. It's a long-term plan.
Yeah, that's right. It's a year-round plan of management, and unfortunately I think it's with us for good, but we do feel like we're on top of them now and I'm comfortable with that.
And what are the management practices you do?
So we start out basically by spraying out all the weeds over summer. So what we really want is a bare paddock prior to feeding, so that the snails have got nothing to eat when we put out snail baits. So we bait for snails before seeding. We also, at harvest, we narrow windrow our canola stubbles, and that means we are burning the windrows in autumn. And because we've tried to keep the rest of the paddock fairly bare and hope that the snails will migrate towards those windrows, when we burn them, we get quite a high kill rate.
And that is one thing, is if you do have trash between your windrows, we do know that some farmers haven't had a really good control. And anecdotally, do you know how many times you've had to burn to control your snails?
We were burning for quite a few years there, probably 4 or 5 years we were burning our windrows, and then we felt that it is a big job. It's obviously needs someone fairly senior to run a burning program like that at a very busy time of year. So we've sort of dropped it out of our program, and we feel like we're still managing without it. But if we started to get really high numbers again, then that'd be the first thing we'd bring back in again.
Okay, so we've had some anecdotal evidence from some farmers that after a windrow burn, it takes them 4 years to build up in number. But this really only does work on the small pointed snails. If you have round snails, they have a habit of climbing up high, and they don't tend to congregate under windrows. And this is where for the round snails, it is really burning fence line to fence line, which unfortunately in our part of the world can increase soil erosion risks. So it's something you really need to plan for rather than decide at the last minute, I guess. And once you've windrowed burnt, what do you do then? Do you bait or?
Yeah, so we generally bait our canola paddocks before seeding, and we're waiting for the snails to become active. That will
talk about how they become active. And one thing we did was we looked at when snails actually moved, because I always thought that if it was temperature related, so if it's not too hot and it's just a bit warm, that they'd be actively moving. But what we found was when we looked at hours and hours of footage taken from actually the cameras at your place, Elena, what we found was that it wasn't really temperature that did the movement. So you can see the temperature line here on the bottom. And then we've got relative humidity up on the left-hand side. And we did a score of movement. So 1 being they moved, and 2 being lots of movement. What we found was it's actually in relation to relative humidity. And if you had relative humidity above 75%, we got the most movement. And of course, all movement occurred at night, not during the daytime. So really, relative humidity means rainfall. So if you've had rain and they're actively moving, then you've got to bait. And really timing your baits, Elena, we need to stop the next generation.
Yeah, so we obviously, once we start feeling that we're getting those sort of dewy nights and that the snails might be moving, we go looking for them, and we might even throw a few baits out and see if they take them. But we would collect a few snails and take them to Svet, so she can tell us where they're up to with their breeding cycle.
So snails to breed need to have a developed albumin gland, and the albumin gland needs to start being developed. So you can see here this little blue patch on the left-hand side, that's where the albumin gland is. And I dissect it out. This is the yellow here. And look at the size of it. If it's really little, it's not quite developed. As it starts to grow, it means that the snails are getting ready to produce eggs. And you really need to time the baiting at the right time. So when we've looked at the development of the gland, what we've found is that the gland really starts to increase in size in March and April if we've had rainfall that's occurred in early Feb. They start to develop in March, but usually about this time of year we've only had rainfall in late March, so we're expecting the albumin glands to be fully developed by mid-April. And I've just undertaken some dissections that Elena brought in. And what we're finding is that the albumin gland is starting to grow in size. And when I looked at the guts of the snails, they definitely had green in them. So they're definitely starting to feed. So now's a really good time to bait. And with the round snails, look, it's again, the timing of baiting really needs to occur when they're actively moving and actively feeding. And sometimes that is before baiting. Your only option after you seed is to bait to protect your crop from snails, but then the baits do complete with green plant material. So what we looked at with Sterling's to Coast was, what bait do you want to use? And we looked at all the baits on the market, and we basically found that if the bait was registered, it killed snails.
Yep, so we have based our baiting choice on, basically we go for the cheapest bait that gives us the highest number of bait points per square metre, because we really want to have as many baits on the ground as we can get.
And what we also found was that it didn't really matter what bait amount of active ingredient was in the baits. It really was what you just said, the bait points per square metre. The more bait points you have per square metre, the more likely it is that the snails encounter the bait and die. What bait points per square metre do you guys aim for?
We're targeting 30 to 40 points per square metre. Obviously, you have to make sure that it's within the registered amount for that area, but that's why we basically go for probably a lower dose but more points.
And so if you look at the baits that are on the market, the least amount per square metre we got was 12 and the most we got was 48. So that's why you've got such a varying number down the bottom here. But the more bait points, the better your kill rate, but also your even coverage. So because small pointed snails are not, they're not like your garden snail, which is the big brown ones you have in your garden, which will seek out baits. They seem to encounter them by random encounter, and it appears that if you have your baits piled in one little corner, they'll never find them. But even if you do all this and you bait at the right time and you do everything, are you controlling your populations, Elena?
No, we're still finding that we have snails in the grain at harvest, and this is a big issue for us because obviously we can't deliver grain that has snails in it.
So what we looked at, because we got so many reports about changing the time of harvest so that, if you harvest at this time of day, you get less snails, or if you do this. So what we looked at is when snails move during harvest. And what we found was that they move at night quite often, but their movement up and down stems was really random. There was no correlation between the relative humidity or the temperature or anything like that. It just appeared that if they were actively moving, sometimes they'd move up, and if the sun came up, that's where they stopped moving. So it really came down to the cutting height. It really came down to what other factors were present in the paddock, like whether you're doing nighttime harvest or daytime harvest, because they were moving at night, you're more likely to get them in the grain. But it was pure luck, I think, in some ways, as to whether or not you've got them in your harvested grain.
It certainly correlates with us because we do find that the numbers can vary quite a lot from paddock to paddock. But yes, we use a seed cleaner to remove, we put all our canola through a seed cleaner, which is really not an easy job.
And this big pile here, is that all snails, Elena?
Yeah, there's a bit of chaff in there, but there's a lot of snails in there. And this is obviously a big cost in time and money to our business. So if you don't have snails or they're just starting, I would certainly recommend getting on top of them. We're obviously double handling our grain. Generally, we can get away with just cleaning the snails out of canola, and we haven't had to clean our cereals yet. But occasionally we have to use the snail roller to crush the snails. And that is just another step. And obviously it's something we really would prefer not to do. But we had a really wet year in 21, and I think the wet conditions obviously increased the number of snails that were out there, but also it reduced the amount of grain that we had. So basically it was just a dilution effect, meaning that we had to sort of roll grain again for the first time in a while.
Oh, goodness, and I believe the Kingway roller here is in great demand in WA at the moment.
Yes, I have heard reports that the only place that's producing snail rollers in South Australia has stopped taking orders because they've just got too many. So relying on a snail roller is probably not a good idea.
And one thing that we have had anecdotal evidence of is that growers that have used a stripper front in the same paddock as a conventional front have found that they do get less snails in the harvested grain if they use a stripper front. So that's something to maybe consider. But again, it's not a solution in the long term. It's just something to get you through harvest.
Yeah, that's obviously not suitable for canola, unfortunately.
Oh, yeah, there is that too. But we have had lots of reports of swathers and other farm machinery having snails on it, and I know that your farming enterprise has tried very hard to clean off machinery. It's nearly impossible.
Yeah, I mean, in our case, the snails were pretty much already there when we noticed them. So trying to reduce contamination, it probably wasn't as big of an issue for us. But as you can see from that picture, that was the swather. You can just see how many snails are in there, and anyone who's cleaned a header knows how difficult it is to get them 100% clean. So basically trying to be really proactive and looking for snails and stopping them before they start spreading around your farm, especially around sheds and where, basically where pallets come in, where machines come in, that's where you need to start looking.
And you can see here on the right-hand side is a little snail on a car wheel. And that's really how they do get dropped off onto farms. A single snail by itself that hasn't mated can't lay eggs. So you do need two of them, ideally. But a single snail that has mated can go and lay eggs. So that is one thing. We do get lots and lots of reports of people trying to spray for snails. So we did a trial a few years ago looking at the effect of different sprays on snails, only on the small pointed snail. And what we found was that nothing worked. And also we looked at the snails were sprayed while they were actively moving. So it wasn't as if they were in their little shells. The substrate they were on was sprayed as well. And we looked at their movement up and down the substrate. And we found that no matter what we sprayed the standing stubble with, the snails still kept moving. And we didn't get anywhere near significant mortality after 21 days. So the letters indicate significance between treatments. One other thing to mention is that you really need to know your snails, because any mechanical movement on the soil surface will control round snails. But did you guys find any effect from cabling?
No, we haven't really done a lot of that, but Stirling's to Coast has obviously looked at the trial that they did.
I will. You can talk on it.
No, we haven't actually done anything like that. And even our claying program, which is pretty vigorous, obviously, soil disturbance, it didn't actually reduce the snail numbers. It's certainly not in the long term.
No, and the Stirling's to Coast have done a number of trials, all available on their website. They tried cabling, speed tillering, stubble crunching, all to control the small pointed snail, and pretty much none of it worked.
No. They are effective in South Australia. They use those methods to control the round snails and maybe the larger conical snails, but they're just different. They bury underground over summer, so you're either completely disturbing the soil, which is not that effective anyway, and obviously down our way that's going to lead to erosion.
So really, if you don't have snails, make sure you don't get them. But I don't think there's anything like eradication. I don't think that's a option for any farmer. I think it's just management.
No, we're still waiting for that bit of research that can help us with that. But at the moment, it is just year-round management, unfortunately. And like I said, we're on top of them at the moment. We're delivering our grain, but it would be better if we didn't have snails.
And I guess we've got a few projects we need to acknowledge because, Elena, you've been involved with quite a few with the Sterlings to Coast farmers and put together a really good case studies. And there's a lot of information on the Sterlings to Coast website. There's the projects have all been funded through COGO and GRDC, so we do thank them quite a lot. And the GRDC website has a plethora of information on there. They've got a new slug tab that you can click on and get all the information, and our DPIRD website. But look, I really strongly suggest that anyone listening to this doesn't just listen to Elena, but does look at some of the stuff you've written, because those case studies are pretty good.
Thank you, Fred.
And now we'll go to the live question and answer session. So please put forward your questions and answers in the chat tab, and Cindy will be along shortly to chat about them.
Okay, so we have had the questions, but was that Lyme data from a field or plot trial?
I should have mentioned it at the time. It was from a pot trial, not from the field.
Thank you very much. I apologise. I said plot instead of pot, but fortunately you understood what I meant. And we have also had previous questions come up before the webinar, so we have made a note to ask them today. We also have Elena, the grower presenter, online. So thank you, Elena. If anyone would like to ask Elena a question as well. What is the shortest time to leave between spreading baits and seeding to get a good kill on snails?
That's a really good question. We did a trial with Sterlings to Coast where we fed snails that were field collected. And what we found was after 7 days, we killed what was going to eat on the bait, but there were still a number of snails that did not feed on the bait. So that's one thing to take into account, that within 7 days, you'll get a good kill if things are actively eating and feeding. However, there will always be a portion of small pointed snails, especially, that don't feed on baits.
Thank you. And other question that has come in before this webinar, do snails preferentially graze on a broadleaf over a grass?
We have seen that even round and small pointed snails, if they've got a food choice between a broadleaf and a grass, we tend to find that the broadleaves do get more feeding damage than grasses, i.e. cereals.
Thanks, Vet. And I'd just like to mention that today's webinar recording will be put on the DPIRD YouTube channel in the near future. We will also be publishing these PowerPoint slides on the About Pest Facts webpage, which is mentioned on the screen. If you do think of a question after the webinar, here are our presenters' contact details for Svetlana and Elena. I'd also like to acknowledge the RPM for Grains project who hosted this project behind the scenes. And that brings us to the end of the webinar. I'd like to say a very big thank you to everyone who attended today. Thank you, Svetlana and Elena, for doing the presentation. And thank you, Jeanette, for co-hosting behind the scenes. And as I mentioned, the recording and PowerPoint slides will be available for viewing shortly. And for now, we'll say goodbye and we wish you all a great day. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.